The Velkari expedition had been digging for 3 rotations when they discovered what their xenoarchaeologist euphemistically called organic preservation chambers, which was, to anyone with functioning sense organs, a polite way of saying graves. But Dr. Corvin Thexend possessed the particular brand of academic arrogance that allowed him to rename uncomfortable truths until they became manageable hypotheses. "Fascinating construction methodology," Thexend muttered, his 4 eyes scanning the geometric precision of weathered headstones arranged in careful rows. Primitive but systematic, the humans buried their deceased in remarkably organized patterns. Captain Elena Voss watched from the expedition perimeter, arms crossed, wondering how someone could achieve 3 advanced degrees in xenoarchaeology while remaining spectacularly ignorant about the species they claimed to study. The cemetery stretched across a hillside overlooking what had once been New Barcelona, now little more than atmospheric readings and faded colonial records. "Doctor," Voss called, her voice carrying the particular strain of patience that came from explaining obvious things to brilliant people. "Perhaps we should reconsider the excavation parameters." Thexen's primary manipulator appendage waved dismissively. "Captain, I appreciate your cultural sensitivities, but we cannot allow primitive taboos to obstruct legitimate scientific inquiry." The Thurian team coordinator, Jex Rill, clicked her mandibles in what might have been amusement. The human speaks of sensitivities as if burial sites possessed emotional significance beyond biological disposal. "That's exactly what I'm suggesting," Voss replied, walking closer to the dig site where mechanical extractors were already positioning themselves above the first grave markers. "Human burial customs aren't just disposal methods, they're protective protocols." "Protective against what?" asked Velmore, the expedition's Nexarian anthropologist, his translucent head tilted with genuine curiosity. "Decomposition? Bacterial contamination? Your species developed adequate preservation technology centuries before achieving interstellar capability." Voss paused, watching the extraction equipment lower its primary boring apparatus toward a headstone carved with symbols in 3 human languages. How could she explain to beings who viewed death as a simple transition between biological states that some transitions required specific handling procedures? Over 97% of viewers here are watching without subscribing. Don't be one of them. Hit that subscribe button right now and join the journey. Every click helps us grow stronger, and you'll never miss the next epic story. "Dr. Thexend," she tried again, "human colonies maintain burial site registrations with specific excavation restrictions. These sites are marked as culturally protected zones." "Yes, we reviewed the colonial administration files," Thexend replied, without looking up from his sensor readings. "Quaint regulations designed to accommodate human mythology. The Galactic Archaeological Council's authority supersedes local cultural preferences." Jexaril's mandibles clicked again. "The human seems distressed by our presence here. Do your species associate negative emotional responses with deceased biological matter?" "It's more complex than that," Voss said, watching the first boring apparatus begin its descent. Different human cultures developed elaborate customs around death and burial. These weren't arbitrary traditions. They were practical responses to— "To what?" Velmore interrupted. "Fear of biological processes? Your species conquered interstellar travel, terraforming, and quantum communication, yet remained superstitious about organic decomposition. The boring apparatus contacted the first headstone with a grinding vibration that seemed to resonate through the ground beneath their feet." Voss felt something shift in the air, a subtle wrongness that reminded her of atmospheric pressure changes before severe weather. "The customs weren't about decomposition," she said quietly. "They were about making sure things stayed buried." Thexend finally looked up from his instruments. "Captain, with respect, Your anthropological interpretations lack scientific foundation. Human burial practices represent psychological coping mechanisms for mortality anxiety, not functional protocols for biological containment. Biological containment? Jexril's compound eyes focused on Voss. What does the human believe requires containment about deceased organic matter? The drilling stopped as the apparatus reached its programmed depth. A section of headstone cracked, revealing carved text beneath centuries of weathering. Voss read the inscription with growing unease. Here lies Marcus Delacroix, 2387 to 2441. Rest in peace. Do not disturb. They all say that, she murmured. Say what? Velmore asked. Do not disturb. Every human headstone includes some variation of that phrase. Rest in peace, eternal rest, undisturbed slumber. We don't just ask the dead to rest, we insist on it. Poetic language for burial markers, Thexan said, directing his team to begin extracting the coffin. Standard mortuary convention across multiple human cultures. Not poetic, Voss said, backing away from the dig site. Procedural. The extraction mechanism engaged with a hydraulic hiss, and the first coffin emerged from the ground with an almost organic resistance, as if the earth itself reluctantly released its hold. The metal container was remarkably well preserved, its surface bearing the same multilingual inscriptions as the headstone above. Excellent preservation, Jexril observed. Human burial technology achieved impressive longevity even in their colonial period. Doctor, Voss said, her voice taking on an urgency that finally penetrated Thexan's academic enthusiasm. The preservation isn't technological. It's atmospheric. The burial chambers were sealed with specific gas mixtures designed to prevent decomposition, yes, Thexan interrupted. Standard preservation methodology. Nothing scientifically remarkable about atmospherics. Controls in burial containers. The coffin's seal released with a sound like a long-held breath finally exhaled. The lid opened automatically, revealing its contents to the expedition team. Interesting, Velmore said, leaning closer. The organic matter shows minimal decomposition despite the temporal span. The atmospheric preservation exceeded human technological capabilities from that colonial period. Inside the coffin lay what had once been Marcus Delacroix, but 4 centuries of burial had done something curious to the remains. The body showed signs of preservation that went beyond technological intervention, as if something fundamental about the decomposition process had been interrupted rather than prevented. The cellular structure appears suspended rather than preserved, Jexril observed, as if biological processes ceased abruptly rather than gradually declining. Voss felt the wrongness intensify, a pressure in the air that reminded her of childhood storms in the mountains of Earth, when the atmosphere itself seemed to hold its breath before unleashing something terrible. We need to reseal that coffin, she said firmly. Now. Captain, your cultural anxieties are interfering with legitimate scientific observation, Thexan replied. This preservation phenomenon could revolutionize our understanding of human colonial biotechnology. It's not biotechnology, Voss said, but her words were lost as the second extraction apparatus began its work on the adjacent grave. And the third, and the fourth. The expedition team worked with mechanical efficiency, each extraction revealing similar preservation phenomena. Bodies that should have been bones and dust remained disturbingly intact, suspended in a state that defied conventional understanding of biological processes. Remarkable consistency, Velmore noted. Every specimen displays identical preservation characteristics. The colonial settlements must have standardized their burial protocols to achieve such uniform results. They did standardize them, Voss said, watching more coffins emerge from the ground. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Human burial customs are standardized because they work. They keep things buried for specific reasons. Such as? Jexrill asked, but her attention was focused on her instruments, which were detecting atmospheric anomalies around the dig site. Such as making sure they don't come back. The words hung in the air as the wind died completely, leaving the dig site in an unnatural stillness that seemed to press against them from all directions. In the distance, Voss could hear the expedition's communication array crackling with increasing interference. Thexand looked up from the latest extraction, his 4 eyes reflecting growing concern. "Captain, are you suggesting these burial practices served functional rather than ceremonial purposes?" "I'm not suggesting it," Voss replied, watching the sun disappear behind clouds that hadn't been there moments before. "I'm telling you. Human cultures developed these customs because they learned, through experience, that some things need to stay buried. The first coffin, its lid still open, began to emit a sound like slow, measured breathing. The breathing sound stopped 3 hours later, which somehow made everything worse. Expedition communications specialist Kratham had been monitoring atmospheric disturbances since the excavations began, but her Zephyrian physiology interpreted electromagnetic anomalies differently than most species. Where others detected equipment malfunctions, she sensed patterns that reminded her of biological rhythms: heartbeats, respiration cycles, neural activity. Dr. Thexand, she buzzed from the communications array, her wings creating harmonic frequencies that translated roughly to controlled panic. The interference signatures are becoming synchronized. Thexand barely glanced up from his analysis of the preservation phenomenon. 23 coffins now lay open to the alien sky, their contents displaying identical states of suspended decay. Synchronized how? Multiple signal sources pulsing in unison. The mathematical precision suggests artificial coordination rather than random electromagnetic activity. Captain Voss had spent the intervening hours reviewing colonial records on her personal datapad, searching for any documentation about New Barcelona's burial practices. What she found made her increasingly uncomfortable. The settlement had maintained meticulous records about everything except their cemetery protocols. No burial procedures, no preservation techniques, no explanation for the elaborate inscriptions warning against disturbance. "Kratham," Voss called, "are you detecting any signals from the settlement ruins?" "Negative, Captain. The synchronized pulses originate from..." Kratham's wings stopped mid-buzz. "They originate from beneath us." Velmore looked up from the spectrometer readings he'd been analyzing. "Impossible. The ground-penetrating sensors show no technological installations below the burial site." "I'm not detecting technology," Kratham replied. "I'm detecting organized electromagnetic activity from organic sources." Jexrill's mandibles clicked with skeptical amusement. "The Zephyrian suggests deceased biological matter is producing coordinated signals. Fascinating hypothesis, but contrary to fundamental biological principles." "Unless the biological matter isn't deceased," Voss said quietly. The expedition fell silent, except for the subtle humming of analysis equipment and the increasingly erratic crackling from the communications array. In that silence, something else became audible, a sound like shifting earth, as if the ground itself was adjusting its position. "Motion sensors are active," Velmore announced, his translucent head swiveling toward the detection grid surrounding the dig site. "Multiple contacts moving beneath the surface." "Subsurface geological activity," Thexand said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "The excavation process has destabilized the soil matrix." "Doctor," Voss said, consulting her datapad, "I found something in the colonial archives." New Barcelona filed repeated requests for military assistance during their final months of operation. Military assistance for what? They never specified. The requests were classified under biological containment protocols. Jexril's compound eyes focused on Voss with sharp attention. Biological containment suggests disease management. The colony encountered pathogenic organisms? Maybe. Or maybe they encountered something that made them develop specific procedures for handling the dead. Voss gestured toward the open coffins. The preservation technique isn't meant to prevent decomposition. It's meant to prevent reanimation. Reanimation, Velmore repeated slowly. The human proposes that organic matter can resume biological activity after termination. Not resume, Voss corrected. Continue. What if death isn't termination for humans? What if it's transition to a different state that requires specific management? The motion sensors registered increasing activity. Not random movements, but coordinated shifts following patterns that suggested purpose, rather than geological instability. The electromagnetic pulses Kratham detected were growing stronger, their synchronization becoming more precise. Captain, Kratham buzzed urgently. I'm receiving structured signals. The patterns resemble communication protocols. Communication between what? Thexend demanded. Between the sources beneath us and something else. The signals are being transmitted beyond the dig site. Voss felt her stomach clench. How far beyond? Initial analysis suggests a radius of approximately 50 kilometers. The signals are reaching the ruins of New Barcelona. The expedition exchanged glances that conveyed species-specific expressions of unease. 50 kilometers encompassed not just the colonial ruins, but the current human settlements that had been established in the region. Doctor, Voss said, we need to reseal those coffins immediately. Captain, premature termination of the excavation would represent significant scientific loss. Scientific loss? Voss interrupted. The dead are sending signals to each other across 50 kilometers of terrain. Does that sound like normal biological behavior to you? The signals could represent residual electromagnetic activity from colonial technology, Velmore suggested, but his words carried no conviction. Automated systems maintaining communication networks despite infrastructural decay. Automated systems that activate only when burial sites are disturbed? Voss asked. Systems that no colonial records mention? Systems that produce biological rather than technological signatures? The ground beneath the first excavated coffin began to sink slightly, as if something underneath was creating space for movement. The breathing sound resumed, but now it came from multiple sources, a chorus of slow, measured inhalations that seemed to sync with the electromagnetic pulses. The atmospheric composition around the coffins is changing, Jexril reported, her sensors detecting chemical variations. Oxygen levels are decreasing while carbon dioxide concentrations increase, as if respiratory processes were consuming available gases. Respiratory processes, Thexend said faintly, in deceased biological matter. Not deceased, Voss repeated. Dormant. Human burial customs weren't designed to honor the dead. They were designed to keep them asleep. Kratham's wings created a discordant buzz that translated to alarm. Captain, the communication signals have changed pattern. They're no longer coordinating among local sources. They appear to be summoning. Summoning what? Response signals are being detected from locations throughout the planetary surface. The pattern is expanding beyond the original 50-kilometer radius. The expedition watched as their motion sensors registered activity across an increasingly wide area. Not the random movements of geological instability, but organized responses to the signals emanating from the disturbed burial site. Every human cemetery on the planet, Voss said with growing horror. They're all connected. The breathing sounds grew louder, more numerous, as if something long asleep was beginning to wake. The electromagnetic pulses became a steady rhythm, like a planetary heartbeat calling to scattered parts of itself. And in the distance, from the direction of New Barcelona's ruins, came an answering sound. The whisper of movement through empty buildings, of footsteps on abandoned streets, of things that had been waiting patiently for someone to break the first seal. Thexen's 4 eyes focused on Captain Voss with the particular intensity of someone whose worldview was crumbling in real time. "Captain, what exactly did we just wake up?" The first one climbed out of its coffin with the methodical precision of someone getting dressed for work. Marcus Delacroix, or what had been Marcus Delacroix 4 centuries ago, sat up with joints that moved like well-maintained machinery, despite their obvious age. His eyes opened to reveal pupils that reflected light with an unnatural luminescence, and when he turned his head toward the expedition team, his movement carried the terrible patience of something that had been waiting a very long time. "Fascinating locomotion patterns," Velmore whispered, his scientific training overriding his survival instincts. "The muscular coordination suggests functional nervous system activity, despite prolonged biological dormancy." "That's not dormancy," Voss said, backing towards the expedition vehicles. "That's hibernation with intent." Marcus Delacroix stood with fluid grace, brushing centuries of burial soil from clothing that should have decayed to threads, but remained remarkably intact. He spoke a single word in colonial Spanish. "Finalmente." Finally. "The specimen demonstrates retained linguistic capability," Jexrill observed with academic fascination. "Neurological pathways appear fully functional despite the temporal gap." "They're not specimens," Voss snapped. "They're colonists who died with unfinished business." More figures were emerging from the excavated coffins, each displaying the same deliberate movements and luminescent gaze. Men and women of various ages, their colonial-era clothing preserved as impossibly as their bodies, rising with expressions of grim purpose, rather than confusion or disorientation. "Dr. Thexend," Cratham buzzed frantically from her communication station. "I'm receiving complex linguistic transmissions across multiple human colonial languages. The signals are coordinating evacuation procedures." "Evacuation procedures?" Thexen's voice cracked slightly. "Evacuation from where?" "From everywhere, Doctor. The signals are instructing human populations to withdraw from all settlements within a 1,000-kilometer radius." Captain Voss felt something cold settle in her stomach. "They're clearing the field." The risen colonists moved with choreographed efficiency, each taking specific positions around the dig site, as if following predetermined roles in an ancient plan. They showed no interest in the alien expedition team, treating them with the casual indifference of professionals dealing with minor obstacles. "Their organizational structure suggests military training," Velmore noted, his scientific curiosity overwhelming his growing alarm. "Combat formations adapted for excavation site defense." "Not defense," Voss said, watching Marcus Delacroix gesture to his companions with hand signals that belonged to no human military she recognized. "Preparation." A woman in colonial medical attire approached the communication array where Cratham waited with frozen wings. She spoke in accented standard. "Zephyrian communications specialist, you will broadcast withdrawal instructions to human settlements. Technical specifications will be provided." I don't take orders from deceased biological matter," Cratham managed. The woman tilted her head with predatory curiosity. "Deceased? An interesting perspective. I am Dr. Carmen Vasquez, Colonial Medical Officer, New Barcelona Settlement. I died in 2441 from acute radiation exposure during the stellar mining incident. How does my current state suggest biological termination?" Jexrill's mandibles clicked rapidly. "The entity claims retention of personal identity and professional designation, despite obvious termination of biological functions." "What termination?" Dr. Vasquez asked with genuine puzzlement. My cardiac rhythm maintains regularity, my neurological activity remains optimal, and my cognitive processing operates at peak efficiency. By what metric am I terminated? You've been buried for 400 years, Velmore said weakly. I've been waiting for 400 years, Doctor, Vasquez corrected. Waiting for someone to break the seals so we could finish our work. Marcus Delacroix joined the conversation with the casual authority of someone accustomed to command. The mining operation required specific containment protocols. The stellar incident created contamination that threatened planetary security. Standard colonial procedures proved inadequate. So you died, Thexan said, his academic mind struggling to process information that contradicted fundamental principles of biology. We transitioned, Marcus corrected. Death, for humans, is not termination, but transformation into a state more suitable for long-term problem resolution. Your species understand biological death as cessation. For humans, it represents career advancement. The communication array crackled with incoming signals as human settlements across the planet began coordinating withdrawal procedures. Evacuation shuttles lifted from distant cities, while automated systems initiated lockdown protocols in mining facilities, research stations, and industrial complexes. What problem required 4 centuries of waiting? Voss asked, though she suspected she didn't want to know the answer. Dr. Vasquez consulted what appeared to be a medical scanner that materialized from thin air. The stellar mining incident created temporal spatial distortions in the planetary core. Conventional containment required technological solutions unavailable to colonial-era humans. Post-mortem humans, however, operate according to different physical principles. Different how? Velmore asked. Death removes certain limitations, Marcus explained matter-of-factly. Temporal constraints, biological vulnerabilities, conventional physical laws. The deceased human population of New Barcelona has spent 4 centuries developing solutions to problems that defeated us when we were alive. More figures were emerging from burial sites across the visible landscape, their forms becoming clearer as darkness fell. Not shambling monsters or mindless undead, but organized professionals carrying equipment that belonged to no technology the expedition recognized. The contamination is reaching critical threshold, Doctor, Vasquez announced, her scanner displaying readings that made no sense to alien sensors. Planetary evacuation must commence within 6 rotations, or the temporal distortions will cascade beyond containment. Planetary evacuation? Kratham's wings created a harmony of pure panic. Evacuation to where? Alternate dimensional framework, Marcus said simply. The living lack the constitutional flexibility for dimensional transition. The deceased possess enhanced adaptability for extra-dimensional operations. Captain Voss realized with crystalline clarity that the expedition had stumbled into something far beyond archaeological curiosity. You're going to move the entire planet. We're going to quarantine the contamination, Dr. Vasquez corrected. Standard procedure for temporal spatial distortions of this magnitude. The living populations require relocation to maintain biological viability. The deceased populations will remain to complete containment operations. The expedition team watched in growing horror as the full scope of the plan became apparent. Human settlements evacuating with military precision. Deceased colonists emerging from burial sites with specialized equipment. Ancient problems requiring solutions that transcended conventional understanding of life and death. This is what human burial customs were designed for, Voss said with dawning comprehension. Not honoring the dead, but maintaining standby personnel for civilization-ending crises. Marcus Delacroix nodded approvingly. The human approach to mortality optimization. Death as career transition rather than termination. Very practical for species-level emergency management. Thexan's 4 eyes focused on the rising activity around them, with the particular horror of someone whose entire worldview had just been turned inside out. How long have humans been doing this? Since we learned that some problems require solutions that living people cannot provide, Marcus said. Every human culture develops death customs because every human culture eventually encounters crises that exceed the limitations of biological existence. The expedition equipment began shutting down as deceased technicians took control of the archaeological site with professional efficiency. Their presence made it clear that the excavation had never been about scientific discovery. It had been about activation. The irony wasn't lost on Captain Voss that she was about to be evacuated by people who had been dead longer than her grandmother had been alive. Transport capacity limitations require priority boarding, announced Dr. Vasquez, consulting her impossible scanner while evacuation shuttles descended from the darkening sky. Living biological entities receive precedence due to temporal sensitivity constraints. Thexan stared at the efficient orchestration unfolding around them with the glazed expression of someone whose fundamental assumptions about reality had been systematically dismantled and replaced with something far more disturbing. Captain, in my professional assessment, this exceeds the parameters of archaeological discovery. You think? Voss replied, watching deceased colonial engineers install dimensional transition equipment that looked like it had been designed by someone who understood physics from a completely different angle. Doctor, you just learned that human civilization operates a backup plan involving the systematic deployment of the dead as emergency personnel. Cratham's wings had settled into a low, continuous hum that translated roughly to existential despair. My communication with Fleet Command has been redirected through deceased colonial administrators. They're filing requisitions for dimensional quarantine authorization using protocols that don't exist in Galactic Council regulations. The protocols exist, Marcus Delacroix corrected, supervising the installation of what appeared to be a reality anchor. They're just classified under human emergency management procedures. Living human administrators lack clearance for post-mortem operational directives. Velmore approached one of the dimensional transition devices with scientific curiosity overriding his survival instincts. The technological principles appear to violate several fundamental laws of physics. How does deceased human engineering exceed capabilities demonstrated by living human civilization? Living humans operate within biological limitations, explained a colonial engineer, whose name tag read Chief Technology Officer Maria Santos, deceased 2439. Post-mortem humans transcend those constraints. Death removes regulatory obstacles that restrict living human innovation. What kind of regulatory obstacles? Jexrill asked, her mandibles clicking with fascination despite the circumstances. Sanity, primarily, Chief Santos replied matter-of-factly. Also, physical safety requirements, temporal linearity concerns, and dimensional stability preferences. The dead find these restrictions unnecessarily conservative. The evacuation proceeded with the casual efficiency of something that had been planned and rehearsed for centuries. Living humans from settlements across the planet filed onto transport vessels with the resigned competence of people participating in a drill they'd hoped never to need. The deceased colonists managed the evacuation logistics with professional detachment, treating the crisis as a routine emergency response. Captain Voss, Marcus called from his coordination station. Your expedition team requires special handling due to non-human physiology. Dimensional transition produces variable effects on alien biological systems. Variable how? Thexan asked, with academic concern overriding terror. Complete molecular dissolution, temporal displacement, or consciousness transfer to parallel dimensional framework, Doctor. Vasquez listed clinically. Living alien entities demonstrate unpredictable compatibility with human post-mortem emergency procedures. Perhaps we could evacuate through conventional means, Velmore suggested hopefully. Conventional evacuation requires 12 rotations minimum, Chief Santos replied, checking her reality anchor readings. Contamination cascade initiates in 6 rotations maximum. Temporal mathematics indicates 0 probability of conventional escape. Cratham's wing harmonics shifted to what might have been hysterical laughter. The Zephyrian expedition coordinator will be pleased to learn that first contact with human post-mortem civilization resulted in species-wide dimensional displacement. First contact? Marcus raised an eyebrow with amusement. Captain, your species have been interacting with human post-mortem populations for decades. How did you think human colonies maintained such impressive survival rates in hostile environments? The expedition team exchanged glances that conveyed different species-specific expressions of mounting horror. Emergency personnel, Voss said slowly. Every human colony has emergency personnel we never see. Every human colony maintains appropriate deceased population ratios for crisis management, Marcus confirmed. Standard human colonial administration policy. Living colonists handle routine operations. Deceased colonists manage existential threats. But the Galactic Council reviews colonial population statistics, Thexan protested. Human settlements report only living residents. Living residents require resource allocation, administrative oversight, and biological life support, Dr. Vasquez explained. Deceased residents operate independently with minimal resource requirements. Why complicate colonial administration with personnel who handle their own logistics? The dimensional transition equipment hummed with increasing intensity as reality began to soften around the evacuation site. Space took on a liquid quality that made depth perception challenging, while temporal flow developed subtle inconsistencies that made sequential events feel simultaneous. Final boarding for dimensional transition, Chief Santos announced. Living entities proceed to transport vessels. Deceased personnel prepare for quarantine operations. The expedition team moved toward the evacuation shuttles with the reluctant urgency of people walking toward an uncertain fate. Behind them, the deceased colonists continued their preparations for containing a crisis that threatened to unravel local space-time. Captain, Thexan said as they approached the transport vessel, in future archaeological expeditions, perhaps we should inquire about post-mortem population density before beginning excavations. Doctor, Voss replied, watching Marcus Delacroix coordinate operations with the casual authority of someone managing a routine emergency. In future expeditions, perhaps we should remember that human customs exist for practical reasons. The transport vessel sealed as dimensional transition reached critical threshold. Through the viewports, they watched the planet begin to shift between dimensional frameworks, its reality becoming negotiable under the careful management of deceased colonial professionals. Fascinating, Velmore murmured. Human civilization operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Living populations manage day-to-day operations while deceased populations handle existential crises. It's efficient, Jexrill agreed. Death as career advancement rather than termination. Mortality as promotion to positions requiring enhanced capabilities. Cratham's wings created a final harmony of resigned acceptance. The expedition report will require new classification categories. Archaeological discovery seems inadequate for accidentally activated human post-mortem emergency response protocol. Captain Voss watched the planet disappear into dimensional quarantine, managed by people who had died centuries before she was born, but who treated galactic-scale crises as routine maintenance problems. The expedition had sought to understand human civilization by studying their dead, only to discover that human civilization existed precisely because they had learned to put their dead to work. Next time, she said to herself, we read the warning signs. But somewhere in the back of her mind, she suspected there wouldn't be a next time. Because once you learned that human burial customs were actually emergency protocols for deploying the dead as crisis management personnel, You started to wonder what other human traditions were actually practical preparations for problems the living couldn't handle. And that, she realized, was a question best left unasked.